Hello, students. Preparing for yet another in a series of lectures on individuals and families. This is class number 5. And today we're going to spend some time talking about um, assessment, interpersonal as well as intrapersonal environmental factors. We're going to also look at families through the cultural lens. So we're going to spend some time today talking about some very important concepts that you'll need to learn in your work as social workers in terms of working with individuals and families, looking at that whole assessment process, meeting clients where they are, things of that nature. So as always, we would encourage you to continue to read the assigned chapters, come to class prepared with questions, as well as being willing and able to participate in the in-class activities designed to strengthen the learning concepts for chapters 9 and 10. All right, without any further ado, let's jump into it. So in chapter 9, the goals of chapter 9 actually are really to look at several things here. It's around being able to understand how assessments capture client systems and the reciprocal nature of it, learning the different elements of the assessment around interpersonal functioning, physical, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, spiritual, environmental, understanding substance abuse, looking at affective disorders, many mental status exams and social histories, risk of suicide, and writing assessment. So we're going to spend some time covering quite a few items on today as we move forward. So again, when we think about assessment, areas of attention that often come up when we're looking at working with individuals, whether we're looking at working with families, are really being able to understand functioning in these particular areas. So when we're thinking about biophysical functioning, for example, we're thinking about physical health, we're thinking about whether chemicals are being used, things of that particular nature. We're also looking at how these things impact families or individuals in terms of their functioning. The use of medications and alcohol, cognitive perceptual functioning. So, looking at things like client judgment, reality testing, coherence, assessing for thought disorders, looking at emotional functioning in terms of the affect. So, are we looking at depression? Are we looking at bipolar? Are we looking at a range of emotions that's appropriate in terms of people's ability to function? Behavioral functioning. Are folks impulsive? Are folks deliberate? Do they act in excess? Are they violent? Looking at what are some of the motivations also, as well as, and then also paying attention to the environmental systems that are at play in terms of looking at what families are needing. So again, when we think about biosocial functioning, it's about physical characteristics and physical health. Health plays a very important role in terms of how people function within the context of family and as individuals. So if there are folks who have problematic issues with ongoing health concerns that are chronic in nature, it may have an impact, or it does have an impact, on their overall quality of life and their ability to actually function. So thinking about those things when you're looking at your assessments as well. Also understanding that healthcare or lack thereof plays an important role in terms of people's physical well-being. And at this point in time, there are probably 50 million people in America who don't have health insurance. And so these clients may actually end up at your doorstep. It's not totally out of the scope of reality in terms of that. So again, understanding that physical health piece, understanding the history of where people come from. For example, there's been some research that indicates that histories of child malnutrition can be linked to attention deficits or poor social skills, or so poor performance in school. So things of that particular nature are very important for you as you're moving down that road. Also understanding the importance of assessing the use of medication and alcohol. So how often are folks actually using alcohol? Does it disrupt the normal functioning of the family? Does it inhibit people from being able to function normally as they would, hold down a job, maintain adequate finances, be a proper parent for the family? These particular these are the things that you want to pay attention to in your assessment um, of alcohol and drug use. In terms of how families function, because it does play a role, and it could impair how things are actually progressing. So this is an example of some potential interview questions that you might want to use as you're looking at doing some of that assessment. Also, in the county state world, there is an assessment. It's called a Rule 25 assessment that's done by counties that really look at determining the level of dependence that a client might actually have, which then is linked to the amount of treatment that they're able to obtain based on what's being presented. So it's an interesting concept, and have had to order any number of those in the course of my career. Also, understanding and recognizing that these commonly used drugs have some impact. So, there may be occasions where you're actually interacting with clients, and you may be able to see some of these particular indications in terms of how clients might be responding to you at that particular point in time. So, pay attention, and if things are out of the norm, they tend to be pretty easy to pick up in terms of looking at how folks might be acting based on how some of these particular chemicals enter into the system and cause people to respond and how they actually act. So something to keep in mind through that assessment piece. And as you can see, if you've got these kind of indications and you've got a person that's in the family that has a particular role that they need to fulfill, you can quite easily see where the use of chemicals could actually play a significant role in that ability, the person's ability to actually meet that standard or not meet that standard. The other things that you'll need to pay attention to in terms of your assessment are really looking at the cognitive perceptual pieces. So what's happening with people's thought processes? What's the intellectual functioning like? Are they able to make appropriate judgment based on the situations that are at hand with them? Reality testing. Are they able to answer things in a way that gives us some indication that they are here in the present and are doing things in a realistic way? Are there misconceptions about how things have been said? Or are there values that people hold on to that actually create stress or dysfunction in the context of relationships or even their own interpersonal functioning themselves? So these are things that you have to pay attention to in terms of the assessment as well, because they're very, very important. So looking at emotional control, are folks able to respond in ways that are fairly typical for the situation that they find themselves in, or do they catastrophize, which means that everything is a crisis, everything that doesn't work the way that it's exactly supposed to work becomes an issue in and of itself. Are they able to express an adequate range of emotions, or are they limited? That I'm either happy or sad, and there are no in-between pieces in terms of how I might act or how I might respond emotionally. And then is that appropriate for the situations that people find themselves in? Two of the fairly significant affective disorders that you may hear quite a bit about in terms of the field are the bipolar disorder as well as the major depressive disorder. So you've got bipolar, where you've got behaviors that people may exhibit that run in two different modes. They could be extreme, excessive, unrealistic in some particular instances, and then they can shift back to the other side of the continuum where the affect is flat, or just non-responsive as it needs to be to the situation and the circumstances that are at hand. And then the major depressive order pretty much speaks for itself in terms of people being so depressed that they're not able to necessarily function for periods of time that create some risk. It also has us looking at things like suicidal risk and recognizing that depression will look different in children and suicidal risk as well as adolescents, and will be different also for older adults. So things to keep in mind as you're moving through the assessment pieces. Um, Looking at behavioral functioning in terms of problems that are related to excess, um, and then problems that are related to deficiency. So making sure that these interventions are aimed at diminishing or eliminating these behaviors. So if I've got um, a person that is continually overreacting or really reacting excessively to a fairly minor issue, then we might want to look at how do we come up with interventions that actually bring that back into a much more appropriate form of display, as well as problems related to deficiencies. So it's around, for example, are there deficiencies in behavioral functioning that uh, won't allow a parent to actually do an adequate job of parenting their kids, making sure that they meet their basic needs, that they're kept safe, and that they're not neglected. Um, and then also, what do we need to do then to look at increasing those types of behaviors so that kids are actually kept safe? So that's an example of some of the behavioral functioning you'll be taking a look at as you're moving through this process as well. Um, Understanding these dysfunctional patterns, looking at power and control, nurturance, accepting responsibility. And so as you start to hear the stories that clients share with you, then it's easy sometimes to actually start to identify some of these behavioral patterns, which actually leads to some of the dysfunction that might be happening in the context of that family. So when you understand those things as you are gathering this information, it helps you in terms of making a determination about what's an appropriate intervention based on the severity and the frequency of the issues that are being presented in terms of behavioral functioning. Also wanting to acknowledge and spend some time looking at the whole assessing risk of aggression. Oftentimes we see in the news, we see in situations, and it seems to becoming more pervasive, but these issues of domestic violence. And so really wanting to understand the potential and destructive nature of that particular phenomena um, by assessing some of these things when you're actually connecting with clients. So looking at people's personal histories, if there's a person who has been severely abused, perhaps as a child, there may be a higher likelihood for them to respond in a more aggressive or violent manner in future if that hasn't been resolved. Um, Looking at interpersonal relationships and social supports, the psychological factors, what's happening for them. Is there a mental health diagnosis, physical condition, looking at current threats and plans of violence. Are folks saying to you that I'm so angry that I'm going to actually do harm? And then current crisis and situation. So looking at all of these things are a way to really make a determination about what might be happening here as well. And then assessing motivation. There's a motivational interviewing concept called OARS that really helps us start to look at, so what drives some of the behavior or some of the things that we might be seeing with our clients in terms of these particular stages of pre-contemplation, contemplation, determination, action, and then maintenance. So again, really trying to understand why people are doing some of the things that they're doing in terms of what's the motivating factors for them in terms of that. Assessing social systems. So we're back to kind of the basic needs piece. And so, lack of employment or underemployment, housing, the physical environment. Did you just relocate here from California with a friend and have literally no family here or no social support? Or are you relocating to a part of the country where you're inundated by family and they're always around? Those are all factors that you need to understand and to be aware of in terms of your ongoing work with families, because it's very important, as well as spirituality and affiliation with the faith community. So, are folks connected to a mosque or to a church, or do they have spiritual beliefs and have a value system that honors that in terms of how they might respond or how they look at responsibility? All of these are very important aspects of things that you will need to look at as you're doing this assessment and working with this family to maybe create this social history. Um, this is basically a diagram. So a lot of the things that we have talked about, when we start to look at it from a social support or from society or social context, it's looking at all of these things. Who are the folks that who are the systems that are involved in the lives of the individuals, the families, the children, and what is the quality of those relationships? Because these can be things that could be strengths or they could be deficits for families based on how they're utilized and how they're approached. And then finally, we need to look at also how do we start to write that information. So again, those written assessments, thinking about who your audience is, what's the purpose of the information that you're gathering, being precise, being accurate, being legible. And so again, when we talk about social workers having to be able to write and write professionally, these are some of the reasons why. Because if we're not able to accurately reflect the information, it could have impact on billings, it could have impact on client outcomes in terms of things not be done in a clearly and accurate and timely manner. So that's why we pay so much attention to making sure that those things are done. And so, and you may even remember the SOAP note, which is something that we talked about back in integrated lab, and I actually had you do a couple in class for generalist practice. So making sure that we have those things done. The Menti, we used to call them mini mental status exams, where we were able to actually do some testing or do an assessment of where individuals are as they came to actually meet with us. Um, so again, when we are looking at things like appearance, how are they dressed? Are they dressed appropriately? Could work for or against you. Reality testing, looking at judgment, impulsive behavior, speech, all of these particular things, and that's something you can do just in the context of a really short conversation or interaction with them because you're observing these things. Emotions, mood, affect, thoughts. All of these things that are listed here are things that gives us some status or some indication what might be happening for that person mentally, because they're all connected to what might actually be transpiring for them. Are they having hallucinations? Are there illusions? Are they orientated to place, time, and situation? Do they know who the president of the United States is? Do they know what day it is? Do they know what time of year it is? Those are all things that gives us some sense about where people might be at a given point in time in terms of using these things. So all of these are important notions of things that need to really be looked at and considered as you're moving forward with your assessment.